Today begins the 50th commemoration of our war in Vietnam. We honor each of those names etched in stone. 58,282 American patriots. It's here we feel the depth of your sacrifice. And here we see a piece of our larger American story. Our founders, in their genius, gave us a task. They set out to make a more perfect union. And so it falls to every generation to carry on that work, to keep moving forward, to overcome a sometimes painful past. And one of the most painful chapters in our history was Vietnam. Most particularly how we treated our troops who served there. You are often blamed for a war you didn't start, when you should have been commended for serving your country with valor. When you came home, I know many of you put your medals away, tucked them in a drawer or a box in the closet. You went on with your lives, started families, and pursued careers. A lot of you didn't talk too much about your service. This is what this 50th anniversary is all about. It's another opportunity to say to our Vietnam veterans what we should have been saying from the beginning. You did your job. You served with honor. You made us proud. So here today it must be said, you have earned your place among the greatest generations. At this time I would ask all our Vietnam veterans, those of you who can stand, to please stand as we say those simple words which always greet our troops when they come home from here on out. Welcome home. Welcome home. Welcome home. Thank you. We appreciate you. Welcome home.
On May 25th, 2012, with this speech, President Barack Obama marked the beginning of a congressionally mandated 13-year commemoration of the Vietnam War, the intent of which, he alleged, is to, and I quote, pay tribute to the more than 2 million servicemen and women who left their families to serve bravely and heroically to protect the ideals we hold dear as Americans. It is our fear that the purpose of this commemoration is not to recognize or to demonstrate appreciation for our sacrifices, misguided though they may have been, nor is it motivated by a regret at having victimized both the Americans and Vietnamese who suffered and continue to suffer as a result of their war. Rather, this commemoration is in reality to celebrate a crime, a criminal act of aggression against the Vietnamese people, America's crime, my crime. It is, in reality, to continue to distort history, to perpetrate the mythology that the war was necessary, just and moral, and we who fought there, bled there, killed there, and died there were liberators and saviors, freeing the Vietnamese people from communist domination, patriots fighting heroically to protect the ideals we hold dear as Americans. It is, in reality, to celebrate militarism, hoping to convince the next generation that war is noble and those who fight it heroic, and to entice them to become the instruments of slaughter and cannon fodder in the corporatocracy's perpetual wars for hegemony and profit. So as a result, after some 50 years, we must continue to discuss the American invasion and occupation of Vietnam, not as history, the way historians or scholars may discuss World War II or the Civil War, but as truth-tellers, with a sense of urgency motivated by an uneasiness, an internal unrest, an outrage that we, the veterans, are again being exploited and America is again being lied to. So after some 50 years, we must continue to discuss the American invasion and occupation of Vietnam, because those of us who know the truth about war have a moral obligation to God, to our nation, to the Vietnamese people, and to all the people of the world to dispel the myth and to ensure that history records the truth about the war in Vietnam here is the truth as I see it. Recently, I was invited by Professor Susan Schnall to address her class at New York University, studying what is referred to as the Vietnam War by Americans and the American War by the Vietnamese. I guess nomenclature is merely a matter of perspective. Also to speak was Ly Hua Trung, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam's ambassador to the United Nations. Now, my credentials warranting the invitation, I guess, were twofold. First, by an accident of nature, I was born during a time of paranoia and frenzy in a nation that feared communist ideology as an existential threat and saw Vietnam as the domino that must at all costs remain standing. Second, being a child of immigrants, dutifully instilled with an appreciation and love for our new homeland, I embraced a patriotism, as exemplified by John Wayne, heeded John F. Kennedy's admonition to ask not what my country can do for me, and decided that what I must do for my country was to enlist in the military and fight the communist hordes there in Vietnam rather than here on the streets of San Francisco. The ambassador's credentials, as I saw it, were also twofold. First, by a similar accident of nature, he was born in the city of Hanoi and came of age at a time when American aircraft routinely sought to free the Vietnamese people from communist domination by bombing what was then termed North Vietnam back into the Stone Age. Secondly, despite having endured the horror of America's unsuccessful attempts at liberation and its aftermath of economic sanctions and embargo, the ambassador managed to complete his PhD law degree and assumed a variety of political positions within the government of a unified Vietnam. Now, as a member of Veterans for Peace and a philosophy professor with a focus on war and ethics, I have often discussed my impressions and insights about war and its aftermath in the classroom, at conferences, and with civic groups. I had never, however, had such discussions with someone who had been my enemy. Consequently, I must admit I was a bit apprehensive. Intellectually, I realized, of course, that this apprehension was irrational, that the ambassador was no longer my enemy, if he had ever been, and that the war, my war, is some 45 years gone. But in that other aspect of my being, the psyche, the emotions, the spirit, whatever, the war endures and the passage of time is irrelevant. The discussion began with a PowerPoint presented by Professor Schnall that highlighted the devastation inflicted upon the people and the countryside of Vietnam by the American military machine, of which I was a part. She spoke of the use of napalm and the defoliant Agent Orange, and concluded her presentation by showing heart-wrenching images of birth defects suffered by children born of parents exposed to dioxin. As I prepared to speak and approached the podium, I felt embarrassed and personally responsible for the death, destruction, injuries, and deformities suffered by the Vietnamese people, particularly the children, many of whom were born long after the war had ended. I began by introducing myself as having participated in the Vietnam War, during which I was charged with the responsibility of preserving the lives of some 30 young Marines, average age about 19, a task inevitably entailing the injury and deaths of other human beings who happened not to be Americans, but Vietnamese. Now, the ambassador, he began by describing growing up in an environment of death and destruction, of living in constant anticipation and fear of B-52 attacks. He spoke of the devastating physical, psychological, and emotional injuries suffered by his countrymen and women, so many of them civilians. I spoke of experiencing such arc-like bombing attacks from a safe distance, feeling the ground tremble as though from an earthquake, and being comforted by a realization that no enemy could possibly survive such carnage. The ambassador commented on how the people came to prefer overcast and rainy weather to the beautiful sun-drenched days of their tropical paradise, because inclement weather grounded the bombers and provided the people a brief respite from the unrelenting attacks. I described the apprehension I felt during the rainy monsoon season, when close air support and medical evacuation became difficult, if not impossible. The ambassador spoke of how during his military training he was taught not to hate the enemy, but to differentiate the warrior from the government that sent him to kill and to die. He learned to understand the awfulness of war and to prefer peace. I spoke of being conditioned to kill in boot camp, to regard the enemy as the embodiment of evil, as non or subhuman, of never referring to the Vietnamese as persons, but as dehumanizing them as gooks and slants and dinks. I remembered embracing the illusion, the mythology of war as honorable, noble, and necessary, and going to Vietnam not to kill human beings, but perhaps naively, to exorcise demons and check the spread of the communist menace. As he spoke, the ambassador's admiration and respect for his country's political and military leadership and for the Vietnamese people became apparent. He noted their perseverance and willingness to suffer great personal hardships during the long struggle for national liberation and in enduring the profound economic challenges imposed by severe American sanctions following the war. I spoke of becoming profoundly disillusioned as the mythology I had embraced crumbled and the immorality, futility, and waste of the war quickly became apparent. I remembered the disappointment and resentment I felt, and perhaps still feel, as I realized that I had been lied to, misled by my political and military leaders, and abandoned by my fellow Americans, a deception and indifference that ultimately cost the lives and well-being of so many of my comrades, both during the war and afterwards. The ambassador spoke of the tragic long-term disabling effects of Agent Orange spraying on both the ecology of Vietnam and on the Vietnamese people. He expressed his gratitude to the many American veterans, such as Professor Schnall, who are assisting his government to provide medical and rehabilitative assistance to the tens of thousands still suffering its debilitating effects. I spoke of having no idea at the time of the toxicity of dioxin and recalled so many American soldiers bathing in bomb craters filled with Agent Orange tainted rainwater. I spoke of how we came to regard the Vietnamese landscape as hostile, of waging war against nature, preferring an Agent Orange defoliated moonscape to the lush tropical jungle that provided concealment for ambushes and snipers. I spoke of my own government's years of denial regarding the connection between Agent Orange exposure, dioxin poisoning, and the many serious illnesses suffered not only by the Vietnamese, but by U.S. servicemen and women as well. I remembered my grief, anger, and frustration at the loss of friends and former comrades who succumbed to Agent Orange-related illnesses. Finally, the ambassador spoke of how, in his view, the vast majority of Vietnamese have put the war behind them, how they reconciled both with former American servicemen and with fellow countrymen and women who had supported and fought for the American-installed government in the South. In closing, He expressed concern whether Americans have also achieved such closure, whether we have come to grips with the experience and moved on with our lives. I found the ambassador's final question disconcerting, as it required that I look into places I was not prepared to go. In response, I spoke about how, in my own case, I have accepted personal responsibility for my actions. How despite my efforts at atonement and retribution through activism, working for peace, speaking out and educating the public, particularly young people, about the realities of the Vietnam War in particular and the nature of war in general, my participation in the war remains a source of profound moral pain, of remorse, guilt, and shame. I spoke of my frustration with my country's unwillingness, even today, to admit the truth about its involvement in Vietnam and its continuing effort to alter history, to portray the Vietnam War as noble and necessary, and we who fought it as heroic. I spoke of my disappointment with many of my fellow veterans who should know better, but choose instead to embrace the mythology, thinking, hoping that accepting the illusion of noble cause and personal heroism would somehow placate the demons that still haunt them today. It is clear, therefore, that unlike our Vietnamese counterparts, Americans have yet to achieve reconciliation. Nor have we as a people realized an inner or outer peace, as we cannot heal from illusion or go on with our lives until we face the reality of what we did or what was done in our names. Though little was said that evening that was new and not already painfully clear to many who fought in Vietnam, or who read honest accounts of the war written by commentators like Howard Zinn, Stanley Conower, or Oliver Stone, meeting the enemy face to face and hearing the experiences of someone personally victimized by the war brought home the criminality of my service to country, the extent of my culpability, and the insidiousness of the mythology of nobility and heroism. Such dialogue, though certainly disconcerting and difficult, is crucial for healing and to achieve the reconciliation of which the ambassador spoke. We must end our denial, rationalization, and mythologizing of war, and we must end it now. We must face our demons head on and confront the realities of what we did and what we became. Such dialogue is crucial as well to raise the awareness and outrage of the American public regarding our continuing criminal aggression in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen. Perhaps most importantly, such dialogue between prospective enemies lessens the likelihood of war by making apparent the humanity of the other. With that realization, I thought of Paul Baumer, Eric Maria Remarque's protagonist in his seminal novel All Quiet on the Western Front, who, after having stabbed an enemy soldier who sought refuge in a bomb crater he was occupying, realized the humanity of Gerard Duval as he watches him die. Like Paul, I felt the need to seek my enemy's forgiveness. I quote Paul, "Comrade, I did not want to kill you, but you were only an idea to me before, an abstraction that lived in my mind and called forth its appropriate response. It was that abstraction I stabbed, but now for the first time I see you are a man like me. Now I see your face in our fellowship. Forgive me, comrades. We always see it too late. Why do they never tell us that you are poor devils like us? That your mothers are just as anxious as ours, and that we have the same fear of death, and the same dying, and the same agony. Forgive me, comrade. How could you have been my enemy?"